Alright, to start off, I'm going to show you guys the full mix. That means everything's already been done. The EQ's been added, the compression, all the effects, the beat's been chopped up and mixed. And here it is, fully mixed. And then I'm going to break it down for you guys and show you how I did it from start to finish. Alright, so that was the finished mix. Now I'm going to break down the beat for you guys, starting with the drums, which is a simple kick, snare, clap. And then we're going to build up the beat from there. Alright, you can play out your patterns on your MIDI controller, or if you got an MPC with drum pads, or you could draw them out like I am right now, just because I want to save time. And I just want to get a beat going for you guys so you can see how I build up the basic elements starting from nothing to a completed track. Now what I'm doing here is adding a simple 4-beat kick, clap, snare pattern. And I'm going to be layering my clap with my snare to give it that fuller, thicker sound. Just add more dynamics to my drums. Don't always be so simple, you guys. Mix it up. Like at the end of each phrase, in other words, at the end of my 4 bars here in my loop sequence, I'm going to actually add another kick to the pattern to just give it some more movement. In other words, the kick's going to double up towards the end. Alright, now that I got my drums in place, I'm going to go ahead and add my hats. So I'm drawing out a hat pattern here. Now, some producers do a 1/16 note hat pattern type of sequence. And that's alright, you know what I mean, for certain type of songs. But like T-Minus, 40 Shabazz, Boy Wonder, you know, Drake's producers, they do a lot of different type of hat sequences where they'll take the notes. And what I'm doing here is every other note, I'm actually changing the velocity to give it more of a swing shift type of effect. And at the end of each phrase, where I have this highlighted, I'm adding a 30-second note shuffle. And you'll see with that, see, it just goes from 1/16 note to double time, which is a 1/32 note shuffle. It just makes your hats more interesting. And it's good to experiment with your hats, you guys. I mean, use a combination of different percussion elements. This video right here, I'm using a simple closed hat, open hat. And now I'm adding the open hat. But with the variation and change-ups, like the 1/32 note rolls from the 1/16th note that I started off with on these phrases. In this sequence, it just makes it more interesting when it's rolling through the track. And what I'm adding here is a 1/64th note shuffle. You can even do 1/64th note bursts by going from low to high velocity, but I'm just going to make it a 1/64th note shuffle or roll. And what that's going to do is go from double time to triple time. And you'll hear it right now. Here's triple time. Alright, so now that we got the hats and drums in place, we're going to go on to melodies and bass lines, starting off with some basic keys. Now I'm going to be playing these out live via my MIDI controller. If you notice there's a wave in the MIDI file, that's because that's coming straight out of my keyboard. Now I'm going to be adding the bass line. The bass line is just as important as the drums and the hats, you guys. You got to be careful when you're adding bass lines because you don't want it to overpower everything. You just want it to sit nice and tight in the pocket. You want it to fit right in the beat, you know what I mean? Just so it can drive it and give it some oomph. Alright, now I'm going to add in the synth brass. This is just going to fill in the melody on the hook and give it a fuller type of feel. Alright, so next I'm adding some pads. Now these are actually going to just fill in the hook a little bit more and give it some background, kind of like a bed. It's just gonna fill it in real nice and make it thicker. I like these real lush sounding pads. Alright, so now we have all the elements in the bass line, pad, synth, brass, and melody. Now we need to mix the track. This is the most important part, and this is what takes some time. Alright, so the synth brass here isn't actually standing out in the mix exactly the way I want. So in this kind of case, raising your levels, you got to remember they're going to start peaking if you go too loud. So to compensate for that, add a compressor. Adjust your threshold. In other words, how loud it's perceived to come out on the track when you adjust the threshold to a nice level where it just sounds like it's coming out of the mix a little bit, and then you lower it in the mix so that way it just sits nice and tight in the mix. And as part of mixing, you also want to pan your instruments left and right to give it a wider effect. It makes the track sound fuller and wider when you do this. Adding in some delay and some reverb also makes the instrument a little thicker and gives it some space on the track. Okay, so the synth brass sounds a little too plain, so in this case I want to add some reverb. Not too much, just enough to give it some space. And what a reverb is, it's not delay, but it's still early or late reflections of echoes simulated by room size and type. Vocalists use a lot of flat plates. But what this does is it adds a tail to the end of your notes, so that way the notes aren't so plain and dry, whether you're singing or they're on instruments. And early and late reflections are what causes the reverb to go shorter or longer, and there's other things, other parameters you can adjust, but in this case I just added a touch of reverb to give the synth brass more of a spacey type of feel. It's like a kid yelling down a hall. The sound just stretches out. Not like delay, but it still just stretches out and gives some space. Now we're to the part that I get a lot of questions about, you guys. How do I get my drums to sound fatter and fuller in my mix? Well, it's called parallel or New York compression. Go to Google to actually get a more defined explanation, but I'll break it down. Drums and hats tend to disappear, or they start to go away in the mix the more instruments that you add, and what people make a mistake of doing that I've noticed is they raise the volume of their drums so that way they can stand prominent in the mix. But sometimes you peak and distort the signal, and that's not a good thing, so I'm going to show you how to avoid that right now. You take a compressor and you add a duplicate copy of the compressor, and a lot of compressors, not just the one I'm using, comes with the sidechain. If you notice now that I added it, it's fuller. When I take it off, the drums disappear in the mix again. I add it again, the drum thickens up. That's because the one compressor is feeding off the other. One is dry, feeding the wet signal, and you can look that up too for a more defined explanation, but this causes the sound to be thicker without raising the volume, so you don't peak and distort your signal. So that's what this compression does. It actually makes the instrument sound a lot louder without having to raise your levels to a point where they're peaking and distorting. A nice trick that a lot of producers in the industry, including myself, use to get that fuller, fatter sound. Okay, what I'm going to do now is I'm going to add some reverb to my clap. And what that does is it just creates more suspense on the track. It just gives it a cooler type of sound and just fills it in more with more character. Reverb can be used again for a lot of different things, but in this case I use it just to give that plain sounding clap more of a spacey type feel, so it sounds like it's traveling more throughout the track, and it just fills it in a lot better. What I'm doing here is I'm playing with all the different parameters of the reverb, the dry and wet signal, the diffusion, the time. And the dry and wet signal is how much of the clap is being affected with the reverb. Anything you add to your mix can affect the outcome and feel of your track. In other words, adding reverb to the clap and the hats, it just gives it more space and more of a better fill in. And now we're going to add the same compression to the hats. Listen as I add the same compression to the hats. I left them dry so you can hear them on the track, but they're still not as crisp and polished. Check this out. Right now I'm running the parallel compression, but if I turn the sidechain off, the hats disappear in the mix. I turn it back on, they get fuller and they sound louder. That's the beauty of sidechaining and parallel compression. It just makes things sound fuller and thicker in your mix, without having to go too loud so you don't distort or peak the signal. Now the hats have a more polished and more complete feel, and they just sound fuller in the mix, and you can hear them a lot better, and they're not even that loud in the mix. That's parallel compression in a nutshell. That's how I get my hats and my drums to sound fuller and thicker in the mix without going too loud. Hope that helped you guys out. Here's another trick I use, and many producers in the industry as well use EQ on your instruments. I just played a tiny little sample so you can see that the piano was dry, but watch what this EQ does to it as I mix it in. Alright, I soloed the piano track and added the EQ, and now what I'm going to do is look for the highest peak in the frequency. And what I'm looking for is a whistling sound. That high-pitched whistling sound is a good thing in this case, and the reason is this is where we're finding the highest peak in the frequency, and we're going to cut it. Alright, so using the mid filter on this 6-band EQ, we found the highest peak in the frequency of the piano, which is the part that makes the piano jump out at you the most in the mix. We're going to cut it right where that whistling sound is. You can use any 6-band EQ for this, any brand. Just make sure you're using the mid filter for this. Now that we found the highest peak of the frequency in the mid-range of the piano and cut it, it's not going to jump out at you in the mix or sound so harsh when played at loud volumes. What's going to happen is it's going to give it a nice, polished, fuller feel, and it's going to sit right in the pocket of the mix. Now I'm going to do the same exact thing to the other instruments as well. Using the mid filter on the 6-band EQ, I'm going to find the highest peak in the frequency, and once again we're going to cut it where that whistling sound is, because that's where the highest peak is. And that's going to give this that living space where we cut a hole in the frequency for that instrument to exist without jumping out at you in the track. Remember, use your mid filter on any kind of 6-band EQ. You can do this. Now if you listen to the difference, the pads are going to sound more tight and in the pocket of the mix without being too loud, and you're still going to be able to tell that they're there. Remember, EQ and compression are your best friends. They make a huge difference in a mix. By cutting holes in each frequency, we gave each instrument its own living space so each sound can coexist on the track. In other words, the piano, synths, pads, and drums all now sound more tighter and glued together. In other words, you can actually mix your instruments and bring out quieter instruments to appear louder by EQing them and compressing without going too loud so they don't jump out at you. Have you ever noticed that sometimes if you're mixing a track, an instrument will jump out at you and it sounds too harsh? Well, this is how you fix that. And remember, when you're mixing your instruments, don't just mess with the levels. Mess with the pan left and right of your instruments to give the track a fuller feel. Add delay and reverb and tons of other effects out there, but that's how I get a clean mix. Alright, after I have all my instruments mixed and cleaned up, I break it down to a song. I usually start off with an intro if I do have one, verses, hooks, and then a bridge if there's one, and then the outro. This is how you put a song together, you guys. At least this is the way that I do. Everyone has a different approach. But remember, there's not just one way to make music, you guys. There's not one way to produce. There's thousands and infinite possibilities. Now what I'm doing is I'm breaking down the track. I'm going to first duplicate the first loop, because after I made my melodies, I put them into a loop form. And the way I break it down is, it's a cool little trick that I do too. Not everyone's going to do the same, remember that. But I take elements out of the mix, and then I break down the drum parts So that way it just has more of an intro feel. Now sometimes I'll get more complex, but this is a more simple song, so I'm just taking out certain parts of the drums and the melodies, so that way it sounds more like an intro leading into a hook. And as you can see, I'm breaking it down. Chop up the track at some points. Maybe the drums should be chopped and changed up in some areas of the song. Maybe the melody should change during the bridge. This creates excitement, surprise, and movement. Add elements if you feel something's missing. It could be a few things depending on what you're after in your songs. Effects, fill-ins, maybe the hook and verse need more instruments. Don't be afraid to use your imagination and think outside the box. The point of this video is to show you that even the most simple instrumentals take some work. EQ and compression are part of the process. It's not about having the hottest sounds and then you got a hit record. Along with myself, some of the industry's hottest producers implement these techniques to ensure a good, clean mix. I broke down one way I produce a record from scratch. There's endless ways to mix and produce. Remember, you have a good idea, a clean mix, you have a better chance of making hit records.